Canada just deployed military forces to defend Greenland against American threats. That's not a headline from an alternate reality. That's happening right now, and it represents the most direct military standoff between Canada and the United States in modern history. Here's what's actually occurring. Trump threatens to seize Greenland. Denmark refuses. Trump threatens tariffs on 8 European countries unless they back his Greenland takeover. NATO allies deploy troops to Greenland, and Canada is preparing to send soldiers to join them this week. But Carney didn't stop with troop deployments. He unleashed the largest defense spending increase in Canadian history, $81.8 billion over 5 years, quadrupling defense spending over the next decade, targeting 5% of GDP by 2035, submarines, Arctic radar systems, fighter jets, naval destroyers, space-based surveillance, all aimed at one strategic goal: securing the Arctic without American protection. This isn't theory. NATO is experiencing what Carney called a test right now. Canadian forces are on standby. Denmark is bolstering Greenland defenses with support from Germany, Britain, France, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and Finland. All countries Trump is now threatening with tariffs because their troops are protecting Greenland's sovereignty. Today, we're showing you how Trump's Greenland obsession triggered Canada's complete military transformation, how Carney turned a sovereignty threat into an $82 billion Arctic dominance strategy, how Canada went from NATO's weakest contributor to planning the alliance's strongest northern defense, and why this represents a permanent break from decades of Canadian dependence on American military protection. But before we dive into this story, if you appreciate in-depth analysis like this, hit that like button and subscribe to stay informed on the stories that truly matter. Let's start with what Trump actually did. On January 17th, 2026, Trump announced tariffs on the 8 European countries: Denmark, Norway, Sweden, France, Germany, the United Kingdom, the Netherlands, and Finland. 10% immediately, 25% by June 1st if they don't agree to sell Greenland to the United States. These weren't symbolic. These were designed to punish America's closest NATO allies for protecting Danish sovereignty. Carney's response wasn't to negotiate Greenland's status. It was to defend it militarily. Within 48 hours, Canadian officials confirmed the military was preparing troop deployment to Greenland. A small contingent of Canadian soldiers ready to fly to Greenland by the end of that week, joining NATO forces from Germany, Britain, France, Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, Sweden, and Finland, all conducting military exercises specifically designed to demonstrate commitment to Greenland and Denmark's territorial integrity. But Carney didn't stop there. On November 5th, 2025, Canada tabled Budget 2025 with the largest defense investment in decades, $81.8 billion over 5 years. Breaking down as follows: $20 billion for recruitment, salaries, and health services, $19 billion for infrastructure and equipment upgrades, $10.9 billion for digital modernization and cyber defense, $17.9 billion for expanding military capabilities, including Arctic systems, space programs, and emerging technologies like drones and countermeasures. The Arctic got prioritized. $1 billion through the Arctic Infrastructure Fund over 4 years for dual-use transportation projects, airports, seaports, highways across Canada's far north, infrastructure serving both military operations and civilian communities, northern operational support hubs in Iqaluit, Inuvik, and Yellowknife, over-the-horizon radar systems, 12 conventionally powered under-ice capable submarines for the Royal Canadian Navy, space-based Arctic surveillance, polar communications infrastructure. The mathematical result is simple: Canada reaching NATO's 2% of GDP defense spending target by March 31st, 2026, then climbing to 3.5% in traditional military spending, plus 1.5% in security reinforcement infrastructure, targeting 5% total by 2035. Defense spending quadrupling over the next decade, from roughly $63 billion in 2025 to 26 to over $240 billion annually by 2035. The tariffs hurt Denmark and European allies, but survivors are being protected and supported while they pivot toward a NATO northern strategy that doesn't assume American reliability. Here's where it gets fascinating. The defense spending that used to depend on American security guarantees is now being redirected toward independent Canadian capability. Those submarines have to patrol Arctic waters, The radar systems have to detect threats approaching from Russian airspace. The space-based sensors have to monitor shipping and unauthorized incursions, which forces Canada to build infrastructure that doesn't rely on American early warning systems. So, Canadian defense architecture is being designed for sovereignty that persists even if America becomes hostile, not just indifferent. This creates a fascinating dynamic. Canadian defense costs are rising because protecting Arctic sovereignty independently is more expensive than outsourcing security to the United States. But Canadian strategists are accepting those higher costs because the alternative is depending on an American administration that just proved it will threaten military seizure of Allied territory. Better to pay more for guaranteed Canadian control than risk sovereignty loss from American coercion. Meanwhile, NATO's northern flank faces what Carney called a test. Greenland represents NATO territory. Trump threatening to seize it by economic coercion represents an attack on Article 5's principle of collective defense. Not because Greenland is being invaded militarily, because a NATO member is being threatened with tariffs to force territorial concession. European allies are deploying troops to demonstrate that NATO's mutual defense commitment applies even when the threat comes from the alliance's own founder. The NATO alliance keeps claiming collective defense principles remain intact. They're lying, or they're hoping nobody notices the United States just threatened military acquisition of a NATO member's territory. NATO was designed to protect members from Soviet aggression. The treaty didn't contemplate protection from American territorial expansion. The alliance now faces a scenario where its largest military power is threatening one of its smallest members. And Canada is stepping forward to fill the deterrence gap America created. Here's what Trump doesn't understand. The Arctic that used to be protected by American and Canadian cooperation is being fortified by Canadian investment that assumes America might become the threat, not the partner. The security relationship that defined North American defense for 70 years is being replaced by Canadian infrastructure designed to operate without American support. While Canadian defense spending builds Arctic sovereignty, Carney is executing a diplomatic pivot that doesn't include automatic American alliance. Canada met with NATO Secretary General Mark Rutte in Davos. They reaffirmed commitment to Denmark and Greenland's sovereignty. They emphasized that the first response to this test must be to ensure security of the Arctic, including accelerating new investments in the alliance's northwestern flank. Rutte and Carney agreed Canada would quadruple defense spending over the next decade with significant investments to reinforce Arctic sovereignty. Canada met with Denmark's Prime Minister Mette Frederiksen twice. Once in Paris on January 6th, once by phone on February 2nd. Each time reaffirming that decisions on the future of Greenland are for Greenland and Denmark alone to make. Each time discussing ongoing work to strengthen Arctic security in Canada, Denmark, and across the region, including through NATO. Each time identifying opportunities to deepen cooperation in critical minerals, life sciences, quantum technology, and energy. These aren't courtesy calls. These are coordination sessions for a NATO Northern strategy that assumes American hostility rather than American support. The human cost of this militarization falls entirely on Canadian taxpayers. Canada's defense budget jumped from roughly $40 billion annually to $63 billion for 2025 to 2026. That's increasing to over $80 billion within 5 years, then climbing further toward $240 billion by 2035. The money comes from somewhere. Budget 2025 includes $60 billion in total spending cuts over the next 5 years, a 10% cut to the public sector amounting to roughly 40,000 jobs eliminated. Canadians are paying for sovereignty through higher defense spending and reduced government services. But here's the strategic calculation Carney made. The cost of defending Arctic sovereignty independently is high. The cost of losing Arctic sovereignty to American pressure is catastrophic. Canada controls 20% of the world's fresh water. Massive, critical mineral deposits. The Northwest Passage shipping route that climate change is making navigable. Offshore oil and gas reserves. If Canada cannot defend these assets militarily, America will eventually claim them through economic or military coercion. While American threats escalate, Canadian defense industries that survive this transformation are being positioned better than they've been in decades. Export Development Corporation is being retooled to support Canadian defense industry exports. The new Defense Industrial Strategy prioritizes domestic manufacturing using Canadian steel and aluminum. $2 billion allocated for non-US defense partnerships with Europe and Asia. Canada building submarines, Arctic patrol vessels, and surveillance systems that European and Asian partners might purchase. The endgame is clear. Canada becomes the primary military defender of NATO's Arctic flank, not because America withdrew, but because America became the threat. Defense spending reaches 5% of GDP by 2035. Submarine fleets patrol under Arctic ice independently. Radar networks detect approaching threats without American coordination. Space-based surveillance operates through Canadian and European partnerships, not American intelligence sharing. Northern infrastructure supports year-round military operations in communities that used to be accessible only seasonally. Trump's Greenland obsession doesn't get resolved, it gets worse. Because the president who threatened to seize NATO territory won't suddenly respect sovereignty, he'll escalate threats, propose higher tariffs, suggest military options, and each escalation will drive Canada and European allies to invest more heavily in defense infrastructure that doesn't depend on American protection. The alliance built to counter Soviet expansion is being restructured to contain American territorial ambitions. Canada's Arctic communities see massive infrastructure development, dual-use airports that serve both military and civilian traffic, seaports that accommodate naval vessels and commercial shipping, roads connecting previously isolated settlements, telecommunications networks providing reliable communication, all funded through defense budgets, but serving community needs. The militarization of the Arctic is also the modernization of the Arctic. Communities that used to depend on seasonal resupply and limited connectivity are getting permanent infrastructure that improves quality of life while enhancing military capability. Canada, meanwhile, builds a defense architecture that serves NATO's northern security first, coordinates with European and Nordic partners second, and views the United States as an unreliable actor that weaponizes alliances, and therefore doesn't deserve automatic Canadian deference to American strategic priorities. $82 billion over 5 years isn't just responding to Trump's Greenland threats. It's restructuring Canadian defense for a post-American security model, and that restructuring is permanent. Defense investments don't reverse when administrations change. Infrastructure doesn't get demolished when political winds shift. Submarine orders don't get cancelled when new presidents take office. Buy Canadian policies don't expire. Northern operational support hubs don't close. Trump thought threatening Greenland would pressure Denmark. He permanently militarized the Arctic against American expansion. He made NATO's northern flank stronger, more independent, more capable of operating without American leadership. He made Canadian defense spending massive and sustainable. Canada paid short-term cost, $60 billion in cuts, 40,000 public sector jobs eliminated. But Canada is emerging more sovereign, more capable, more NATO integrated, and permanently positioned to defend Arctic territory without American permission. America paid no short-term cost, but the long-term cost is a NATO alliance that no longer assumes American protection, an Arctic that's fortified against American territorial ambitions, a Canada that builds submarines specifically to operate independently of American naval coordination. Canada wins, Trump loses, and NATO's test becomes NATO's transformation.